The clock tower in the small town of Blackwood struck midnight, its chime echoing through the narrow, deserted streets. Ethan, Olivia, and Kai, 3 university students, wandered the cobblestone paths, the cold night air biting at their faces. They had come to Blackwood on a whim, hoping to uncover the town's secrets for a university project. But what they stumbled upon was far beyond their expectations. As they reached the town square, something caught Ethan's eye. Half buried in the ground, an old pocket watch glimmered under the moonlight. Its intricate design and seemingly pristine condition stood in stark contrast to the dilapidated surroundings. "Look at this," Ethan said, picking up the watch and brushing off the dirt. "This doesn't belong here." Olivia and Kai crowded around him, curious. "It's beautiful," Olivia murmured, her fingers tracing the engraved patterns on the watch's surface. Kai, ever the skeptic, frowned. "It's just an old watch, Ethan. Probably dropped by some tourist years ago." Ethan shook his head. "No, it's more than that. Look at the engravings. These are symbols, not just decorative flourishes. I've seen something like this in one of the old history books." "Let me see," Olivia said, taking the watch from Ethan. She carefully opened it, revealing a surprisingly intact and still ticking mechanism inside. But what was even more astonishing was the faint glow emanating from the clock face. "What the—" Kai began, but before he could finish, the world around them shifted. The air grew thick, the colors of their surroundings blurred, and suddenly, they were no longer in the town square. Instead, they found themselves standing in the middle of a battlefield, soldiers clad in ancient armor clashing all around them. "What's happening?" Olivia gasped, gripping Ethan's arm. "I don't know." Ethan shouted over the deafening noise of battle. "But I think the watch did this." Kai, his eyes wide with disbelief, tried to make sense of their situation. "We need to get out of here now." Ethan frantically looked at the watch, trying to figure out how to reverse whatever had just happened. He noticed that the hands of the watch were moving backward, faster than they should. "Hold on," he yelled, pressing the button on the side of the watch. Instantly, the scene around them shifted again. The battlefield dissolved, replaced by the familiar cobblestones of Blackwood's town square. The 3 of them collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. "What was that?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan held up the watch, now glowing faintly in the dim light. "I think it's a time machine," he said, his voice filled with awe and fear. Kai shook his head in disbelief. "A time machine? That's impossible." "But we just experienced it," Olivia said, still trying to catch her breath. "That was real. We were really there, in the past." Ethan looked at his friends, his mind racing with possibilities. If this watch can take us to the past, what else can it do? The 3 of them stared at the pocket watch, realizing that they had stumbled upon something extraordinary, something dangerous. They had just scratched the surface of what this mysterious artifact was capable of, and they knew that their lives were about to change forever. But as they looked at each other, a silent understanding passed between them. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The past had its shadows, but they were ready to uncover them. The next day, Ethan, Olivia, and Kai gathered in Ethan's apartment, the pocket watch placed carefully on the coffee table between them. The events of the previous night still weighed heavily on their minds, and the air was thick with tension and anticipation. Ethan was the first to break the silence. "We need to figure out how this watch works. If it really is a time machine, then we need to understand its rules, how it takes us to specific points in time and how to control it." Olivia nodded in agreement. "We can't just randomly press buttons and hope for the best. There's too much at stake. We need to be careful." Kai, who had spent the night researching ancient symbols and artifacts, leaned forward. "I found some information that might help. These symbols on the watch, they're connected to an old legend about a group of travelers who could manipulate time. The watch might be a relic from that era." Ethan listened intently, his curiosity piqued. "So, this isn't just a random artifact. It has a history, a purpose." "Exactly," Kai said. "But the legend also warns about the dangers of altering the past. Even small changes can have huge consequences." Olivia's expression grew serious. "So, if we do use this watch to travel again, we have to be extremely careful not to interfere with anything. We could change the future without even realizing it." Ethan picked up the watch, turning it over in his hands. "Then our first step is to test it, to see if we can control where and when we go. Kai handed Ethan a notebook filled with his research. Based on what I've found, there's a pattern to how the symbols align with different time periods. If we set the watch to match a specific symbol sequence, we should be able to choose our destination. Ethan carefully adjusted the watch's settings according to Kai's notes, then looked at Olivia and Kai. Are we ready to do this? Olivia took a deep breath and nodded. Yes, but let's agree right now, we're only observing. No matter what we see, we don't interfere. Kai agreed. Observation only. We can't risk changing anything. With that, Ethan pressed the button on the side of the watch. The room around them shimmered and blurred, and they felt the familiar sensation of being pulled through time. When the world came back into focus, they found themselves standing in the middle of a bustling city square. The architecture was grand and unfamiliar, and the people around them were dressed in clothing from a bygone era. We did it, Olivia whispered, amazed. We're in the past. Kai looked around, trying to identify their exact location and time period. This looks like the 18th century, maybe late 1700s. We're in Europe, probably France, based on the architecture and language. Ethan kept his eyes on the watch, monitoring its settings. Everything seems stable. As long as we don't touch anything or interact with anyone, we should be able to return without any issues. They began to walk through the square, observing the people and the surroundings with a mix of awe and caution. The sights, sounds, and even the smells of the past were overwhelming, but they remained focused on their mission. As they turned a corner, they saw a procession of carriages passing by, and the crowd gathered to watch. The students kept their distance, staying in the shadows, but Olivia couldn't help but notice a young woman in one of the carriages. The woman seemed out of place, her expression filled with anxiety and fear. She doesn't look like she belongs here, Olivia murmured, her curiosity piqued. Something's wrong. Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. We agreed, Olivia. No interference. We can't risk changing anything. But before Olivia could respond, the watch in Ethan's hand started to glow, its hands spinning wildly. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the scene around them started to distort. We need to get out of here. Kai shouted, his voice filled with panic. Ethan frantically pressed the button on the watch, trying to stabilize their position, but the temporal distortion intensified. The world around them shattered like glass, and they were once again pulled through the void of time. When they finally landed back in Ethan's apartment, all three were shaken and breathless. The watch was still glowing, but the light was fading, and the hands had returned to their normal position. We almost lost control, Ethan said, his voice trembling. That wasn't supposed to happen. Olivia stared at the watch, her mind racing. The watch reacted to something, or someone. Maybe it's not just a time machine. Maybe it has a mind of its own. Kai looked at them both, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This is more dangerous than we thought. We're not just observers, we're part of this now, whether we like it or not. Ethan placed the watch back on the table, a new sense of responsibility weighing on him. We have to be more careful. From now on, every step we take, every decision we make, could have consequences we can't even imagine. As they sat in silence, the enormity of their discovery, and the peril it brought, settled over them. The past was no longer just history. It was a living, breathing reality that they had the power to influence. And with that power came a danger they were only beginning to understand. The days following their first controlled journey were filled with a tense silence among the group. The realization that they had barely escaped a catastrophic temporal event weighed heavily on them, and the mysterious nature of the pocket watch seemed even more ominous. They agreed to take a break, to gather their thoughts and decide on their next steps. Ethan, however, couldn't get the watch out of his mind. The thought that they had inadvertently changed something during their last journey kept gnawing at him. He found himself constantly going over the details of their trip to the past, trying to recall if they had done anything that might have had unforeseen consequences. Finally, he called Olivia and Kai to meet at his apartment again. He couldn't shake the feeling that they needed to investigate further, to ensure that they hadn't inadvertently altered history. I've been thinking, Ethan began as they sat down, what if we did change something? Something small, maybe, but significant enough to have an impact? We can't just assume everything's fine. Olivia, who had been restless as well, nodded. I've been worried about that too. What if that woman in the carriage was important? We didn't interfere directly, But what if our presence alone caused a ripple effect? Kai, who had been the most reluctant to continue their experiments, sighed. I was hoping we could just leave it alone, but you're right. We need to know for sure. Ethan placed the watch on the table, its surface now familiar to them all. I think we need to go back, this time, to observe any changes in the timeline. But how do we know where to look? Olivia asked, concern in her voice. If there was a change, it could be anywhere. Ethan opened Kai's notebook, which was still filled with research and notes from their first journey. I've been studying the symbols and the sequence we used last time. I think I can adjust the settings to take us back to the exact moment we left. If there was a change, it should be visible when we return. Kai hesitated but eventually nodded. All right. But this time, we need to be even more careful. We're not just dealing with history, we're dealing with the present too. Any change could affect our own time. With a shared sense of determination, they prepared for another journey. Ethan carefully adjusted the watch's settings, using the knowledge they had gained from their previous trip. Ready? Ethan asked, his finger hovering over the watch's button. Ready, Olivia and Kai replied in unison, though both felt a surge of apprehension. Ethan pressed the button, and once again, the familiar sensation of being pulled through time enveloped them. The room blurred and shifted, and they found themselves standing in the same city square, at the exact moment they had left. But something was different. The atmosphere was tense, the people in the square seemed more agitated, and there was a sense of unease in the air. The grand buildings that had stood proudly before now seemed slightly worn, as if time had accelerated their decay. This doesn't look right, Kai muttered, scanning the area. Something's off. Olivia pointed to a nearby notice board where a crowd had gathered. Let's see what they're looking at. It might give us a clue. They approached cautiously, trying not to draw attention to themselves. As they reached the edge of the crowd, they saw a series of proclamations and news bulletins pinned to the board. One, in particular, caught their attention. It was an announcement of an execution, a name they didn't recognize, but the date was significant. The execution was set to take place in just a few days, on a date that was historically crucial for the country's future. This can't be right, Ethan whispered, his eyes widening. I don't remember anything like this in the history books. Olivia frowned, trying to piece it together. Maybe this is the result of whatever change we caused. This person, whoever they are, might be important. Kai looked at the watch in Ethan's hand. We need to stop this. If this execution happens, it could change everything. Ethan hesitated. But if we interfere, we might make things even worse. We need to figure out who this person is and why they're being executed. Maybe we can prevent it without causing more damage. They began to gather information discreetly, piecing together the events that had led to this moment. It became clear that their presence in the past had somehow influenced the actions of key figures, leading to this drastic turn of events. As they delved deeper, they realized that the person set to be executed was a political figure whose survival was crucial to the nation's stability. If they were executed, it would set off a chain reaction of events that would destabilize the country, leading to a future vastly different from the one they knew. We have to stop it, Olivia said, her voice firm. We can't let this happen. Ethan nodded. Agreed. But we need to be smart about it. We can't just rush in and change things. We need to find a way to prevent the execution without causing more ripples in the timeline. Kai looked at his friends, determination etched on his face. Let's do this. We've come this far, we can't back down now. With that, they set their plan into motion, knowing that the fate of the past, and their own future, was now in their hands. They were no longer just travelers. They were guardians of time, responsible for ensuring that history remained on its true course. When the world solidified again, Ethan, Olivia, and Kai found themselves in an entirely different place once more. This time, the scenery around them was quite familiar. They were in a city square surrounded by buildings and a bustling crowd. However, the clothes being worn, the language being spoken, and the atmosphere around them were definitely not from the modern era. It looks like it won't be too hard to figure out where we are this time, Olivia said, noticing that people were gathering around and excitedly watching something. This could be the Middle Ages, Kai added. Let's find out what they're up to. The trio approached the crowd. In the center of the square, on an old shabby platform, was a chained man. The crowd was jeering at him and throwing mud. Amidst the trial, A priest was loudly accusing the man and declaring his punishment. "If we've stumbled into a witch trial, this isn't a good sign," Ethan said, observing carefully. "If we make a mistake in this era, it could significantly alter the course of history." Olivia took out the watch and began observing their surroundings. "Why are we here?" she wondered. "What could have brought us back to this time?" At that moment, something caught their attention in the midst of the trial. An object hanging from the man's neck had a different kind of brightness compared to the others. It was a pocket watch, though it appeared a bit older. "This is why we're here," Olivia said, her eyes gleaming. "That watch is the same as ours. Maybe we need to retrieve it." "The man is already in trouble," Kai said, staring at the man. "But is it right to leave him here and take the watch?" "If this watch is crucial to correcting the timeline, we may need it," Ethan said firmly. "But if we can save this man, we should do that too." The trio carefully made their way through the crowd towards the platform. Olivia silently approached the man and leaned in. "Where did you get this watch?" she whispered. The man looked at Olivia with tired, fearful eyes. "This watch has been in my family for generations," he whispered. "But it won't save me." "If you listen to us, we can save you," Olivia said urgently. "But first, we need to take this watch." The man helplessly nodded and handed the watch to Olivia. "I don't believe you can save me," he said. "But if you take this watch, maybe the course of history will change." As Olivia took the watch, she felt the world around her shift and felt trapped in that moment. Ethan and Kai noticed Olivia becoming motionless and immediately rushed to her side. "Olivia, what are you doing?" Ethan asked anxiously. Olivia squinted her eyes at the man's face. This watch," she murmured. "This watch might be the key to our time travel. If we use it, we could completely alter the course of history." Kai took the watch from Olivia's hand and examined it closely. "Maybe the two watches need to work together," he said. "This could be what we need to complete our final journey." At that moment, the priest noticed Olivia, Ethan, and Kai. "Have you come to free this man?" he shouted. "Are you witches too?" The crowd suddenly turned towards the trio. People approached them angrily with stones and sticks in hand. "Ethan, it's time to activate the watch," Kai said, panic-stricken. Ethan took both watches and tried to align the symbols. However, the people were rapidly closing in on them. Time was running out. Seeing that the people around them were determined to lynch them, Olivia and Kai began helping Ethan to get the watch to work correctly. Finally, Ethan aligned the two watches to the same symbol and activated them. The world began to spin again, and the people around them vanished. However, this journey took much longer than the previous ones. As the world gradually came back into focus, they found themselves in a familiar place, the center of the old abandoned town they had initially discovered. "Did we make it?" Olivia asked, looking around. Ethan examined both watches carefully. "I'm not sure if we've returned to the right time," he said. "But something is different here. There might be a detail we haven't noticed before." Kai took the watch in hand again and looked around. "Where are we now? What time are we in?" he asked. Olivia carefully examined the watch. "I think we've returned to the right time," she said. "But things are not entirely resolved. There are still things we need to figure out here." Ethan took a deep breath and began moving towards the center of the town. "If there's a reason this watch brought us here, we need to find it," he said. "And this time, we need to get things right." As Ethan, Olivia, and Kai walked heavily through the streets of the abandoned town, they felt a strange sensation. The silence and shadows around them made them uneasy. Throughout their adventures, they had traveled through different time periods, made mistakes, and fought to correct them. But now, they were on the brink of the ultimate resolution. When they reached the center of the town, an old church caught their attention. The large wooden doors of the building were cracked with the wear of years, and the stone walls were covered in moss. However, this old structure emanated a different kind of energy than anything else in the town. "Looks like we haven't been here before," Olivia said, gazing at the church. "But there's something different here." Ethan pulled out the two watches from his pocket and examined them. Both watches had stopped at the same symbol. "This church might be our final piece," he said, focusing on the church. "This place could be what brought us here." Kai tried to force the door open, but it was quite heavy. "We need to get inside," he said, pushing with all his strength. Eventually, the door creaked open, and the trio stepped inside. The church featured a massive organ and rows of wooden pews. However, the most striking thing was a semi-transparent crystal orb standing behind the altar. The orb, it could be our answer, Olivia said, her eyes fixed on the orb. Maybe this is the last piece needed to solve the knot of time. Ethan carefully approached the altar. As he got closer to the orb, it began to glow. With each step, the world around them wavered and blurred. When Ethan touched the orb, a storm erupted around them. Time and space began to warp. Is this the right thing to do? Kai asked, observing the swirling world around them. Maybe this could make things worse. Or it could fix everything, Ethan said determinedly. There's no other way. As the orb continued to shine, Ethan, Olivia, and Kai found themselves caught in the vortex of time. The images swirling around them showed past mistakes and the struggles they faced to correct them. Each scene drew them deeper. But the energy within the orb eventually focused them on a single point. Suddenly, everything around them stopped. The trio found themselves back in the center of the abandoned town. However, this time, the effects of time seemed to have disappeared. The town had come back to life. Buildings were restored, streets were filled with people. Yet none of these people seemed to notice them. Did we succeed? Kai asked, looking around. Ethan looked at the watches again and saw that the flow of time had returned to normal. Yes, he said, taking a deep breath. The timeline is fixed. We've corrected our past mistakes. Olivia smiled as she observed the restored scenery. But this is just the beginning, she said. Time's control is no longer in our hands. But we've learned that everything we do comes with a cost. And we're ready to pay that price, Ethan said, putting the watches back in his pocket. The shadows of the past remain with us, but will shape the future. The trio continued walking through the revived streets of the town. Although it seemed as if everything had come to an end, they felt a sense that a new adventure might be starting. The control of time had slipped from their grasp, but it was not the end of their lives. Perhaps this was just the beginning of a new chapter. I hope you had a good time. If you liked my story, do not forget to comment and subscribe to my channel. Goodbye, see you in the next story.